loud.
Okay.
And I will go back to sharing the screen. There we go.
Okay, looks good.
Cairo Geniza.
Yeah, let's give it about 2 more minutes, and then I want to start.
Yeah.
Okay. Here comes David Wilkinson.
Glory as well.
Yeah.
Are they together?
Okay, David's with us.
Very good. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Pastor. Hi, Ken. Hi, Richard.
I'm here too.
Oh, hi, Donna.
There she is. Oh, did I?
Okay, well, hopefully a couple more people will join us, but I think we'll get started.
All right.
Again, welcome to the forum. Our topic is sacred trash, or the secrets of the Cairo Geniza. And before I go into the lecture, I want to tell a little bit about how I got involved with this or interested in this. Many years ago, my wife and I were invited to a gallery showing and a gallery talk and also a lecture at the Spertus Museum. And the lecturer was Norman Kolb, who was a distinguished professor of Jewish studies at the Oriental Institute and an expert both on the Dead Sea Scrolls and also on the Cairo Geniza. And so that was a very interesting session. And then a couple years ago, I was going through some web page, and I came across this book called Sacred Trash. I thought, gee, that looks interesting. I think I should get that. And the next day, I walked into my library, and there it was, because apparently I had bought the book a couple years ago and forgotten about it. So anyway, the book is the lecture is named after the book, Sacred Trash, which is by Adina Hoffman and Peter Cole, who are, again, a very distinguished husband and wife professor team at Yale University. And I do recommend the book very highly. So let's go to the next slide.
Feedback, Richard.
Okay. What is a Geniza anyway? I mean, when I mention that I'm going to speak on this subject, I get this blank look on people's face saying, what in the world are you talking about? So we want to talk about what is a Geniza, and then later on we'll talk about, or in a few minutes we'll talk about where it's located and why it is of some significance. What is a Geniza? Well, it's a storeroom. It might be as small as a janitor's closet or something like that, or something much larger, attached to a synagogue. And it is a room where one deposits sacred texts and also all kinds of other religious literature that is no longer usable. And we'll talk about that in a moment, what the procedure there is. This is the exterior of the Fustat, or Old Cairo Ben Ezra Synagogue. This is a fairly modern-looking building because it was just restored a few years ago. But it is in a part of Cairo that is the old city right near the Nile River. Okay, next slide. shows us the interior of the Ben Ezra Synagogue, rather elaborate interior. It's been rebuilt and restored many times. I think the current building is probably the fourth or the fifth building on that site. Unfortunately, the Jewish population of that area has diminished so much that it's no longer a functioning synagogue. It's become just a tourist place and a historic site. The next slide shows the doors of the synagogue of the Torah Ark, which, according to various authorities, may date as far back as the 11th century. They somehow apparently survived, the several rebuildings of the synagogue. So that is the location of the Geniza, and let's go to the next slide. And the story begins with two women. They are of Scottish background. Their father was a Presbyterian minister, and they're twins, Agnes Lewis and Margaret Gibson. And they both married pastors or priests. And in both cases, the husbands died very soon after they were married. And so you have these two widow sisters with a fairly sizable fortune left by their father and trying to decide what to do with their life. Well, they decide to become biblical scholars. And between the two of them, they managed to master 12 languages. And uncover a number of very significant documents in the Middle East, including some of the oldest versions of the Bible that we have, at least until we got the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the Gibson sisters are in Egypt. They go to an antiquities dealer who sells them a pile of papers. They bring it back to England, and they look at the papers, and they decide that one of them is particularly interesting. And so they decide to pass it on to their neighbor and good friend by the name of Solomon Shakhtar. Now, we'll talk more about Shakhtar in the next lecture, but we'll just we have a couple pictures of him. And the next slide is Shakhtar as a young man, but usually he is pictured as in this next slide, a very typical picture of what Shakhtar looked like in his adult life. He was a scholar of absolutely prodigious learning. I mean, it's almost impossible to describe all the things that he was knowledgeable in. But he is the one who looked at this scrap of paper that the sisters gave him, and I think it's probably safe to say went berserk at that point, because he realized what he had in front of him was a Hebrew original, a copy of the Hebrew original of the book of Ecclesiasticus. And this particular scrap of paper had been missing for 1,000 years, or almost. And so the next thing he does is to get book passage to Egypt. He goes to Egypt, gets permission to go into because he knows it's connected somehow or other with the Cairo Geniza, gets permission to go into the Geniza, gets permission from the authorities to remove the papers and ship them back to England, and actually fills a ship with boxes of manuscripts that then go to Cambridge University. So that is the beginning, is in 1896, so 125 years ago is the beginning of the Geniza studies. Okay, next picture. This is the document that Shakhtar saw that drove him crazy. And I won't go into the whole history of this, but like I say, this document had been missing for hundreds, if not almost 1,000 years. And there was some doubt whether a Hebrew original of Ben Sira, actually Ecclesiasticus, ever existed, that it was written as a Greek book and was considered by some, since it was not part of the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish Bible, it was considered by some to be a Christian document. Well, with that Hebrew original, Shakhtar was able to prove that it was indeed part of the Jewish heritage. And that made him very excited. He went back, he and others went back to Egypt and were able to find several other scraps of this document. And so we have now almost a complete set of this book. So let's take a little aside and talk about this book, Ecclesiasticus, in the next slide. Oh, excuse me. This slide just shows Shakhtar at his work table. If there is ever a picture of disordered mess, I think this is it. But indicates the condition that some of these papers were in. Okay, now the next slide will tell us a little bit about Ecclesiasticus. Oops. Okay, now Ecclesiasticus is a book that is, as I say, it is not in the Jewish Bible. It is in the Christian Bible, at least the Catholic version of it. It's known by all these different names: Ben Sirach, Sirach, Ecclesiasticus, Wisdom, or the Wisdom of Ben Sirach, probably a couple other versions of it as well. They're all the same book. It's just different names for it. It's a book that was written about 180 BCE and was translated by Ben Sirach's grandson about 60 years later into Greek. So we know a little bit about the history of the book. It's part of the books of wisdom, the wisdom literature, and so it in the Bible that includes the Deuterocanonicals, it's sometimes listed with the wisdom books like Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon and so forth. Okay, next slide. Okay. I call this the art of Genizo maintenance. Genizo, by the way, that's not a misspelling. That's the plural form of a Geniza. But the Genizo are part of the synagogue tradition going way, way back. We don't have any synagogues from the Persian period, but we do know that there was a synagogue on the Masada fortress, and that synagogue had a Geniza attached to it. Nothing in it, but there was a room there. So various Middle Eastern synagogues maintain these storage rooms. Whether this has continued into the present, like in the United States, I don't really know. I'd have to ask somebody whether they, say for instance, if Temple Immanuel has a Genizo or not. So anyway, let's go to the next slide. Let me talk a little bit about here traditional Jewish practice. First of all, very important, no documents that contain the name of God, which is the tetragrammaton or the YHWH, may ever be burned. So the name of God may never be burned. But when a Torah scroll or prayer book is no longer usable, then it needs to be buried with full funeral rites. And that does mean full funeral rites. The books and the scrolls are placed into a coffin, and there are pallbearers that carry it to the graveyard, and it is buried with prayers in the graveyard. That is what's supposed to happen. However, human nature being what it is people tend not to do this, and so the Geniza just keeps building and building and building. Even though it's supposed to be only a temporary storage place. Okay, next slide. Now, we think from what's contained within the Cairo Geniza that there were probably 4 stages, at least for Genizo in general, and that is that only documents with the name of God, which would be a Torah scroll or possibly a prayer book or various liturgical pieces or printed prayers, would have been included in a Geniza. However, as time went on, it became custom to throw all kinds of things into this storeroom. Official correspondence, requests for information from learned teachers and their responsa, which are the responses of the teachers, religious tracts, congregational minutes, anything that was written in the Hebrew language. Fine. Okay. Now we're getting a fairly good-sized pile. Now things go completely out of control. Because then the next step, and this must have happened somewhere probably in the 11th century, anything written in Hebrew characters, regardless of the language, got thrown into the Geniza. And I'll talk about that in just a moment, what languages those could be. And then the final step was what I call house cleaning time. And that is when you clean out your house and there's all kinds of papers left over, you cart them off to the synagogue and dump them in the Geniza. So for instance, your husband left you and left a bunch of business papers. Good way to get revenge is you just take them to the Geniza. Or if grandfather died and left a trunk full of various papers from his life, easiest way to get rid of it is just take it to the synagogue and dump it there. And so that is how the Geniza grew, and it grew, and it grew, and it grew. So, next slide. Now, I'm going to do a little bit of a sidetrack here and talk about language versus orthography. This may be seem a little off the track, but we all know what a language is. English is the one that we're most familiar with. Orthography has to do with the alphabet, the structure in which a language is expressed. So we know, for instance, in English, we use the Latin alphabet. But we aren't the only ones that use the Latin alphabet. French uses it, German uses it, the Norwegians use it, they add a couple more letters. The Hungarians use it, they add a lot of more letters. And there's dozens of languages around the world that use the Latin alphabet. Okay, next slide. The same thing is true of Hebrew. The Hebrew alphabet can be used to express many different languages. Now, the most common, obviously, would be Hebrew. But Aramaic, which has its own alphabet, can also be written in Hebrew. And then there's a language called Judeo-Arabic, which is today a defunct or a extinct language, but nonetheless it was very popular in the Middle Ages, and that is written in Hebrew characters. Arabic, since it's also a Semitic language along with Hebrew, is very easy to change into Hebrew characters. And of course, that process is called transliteration as opposed to translation, where you simply use one alphabet to move a word or sentence from one language, from one alphabet into another, keeping the same language. Okay, Greek is a little bit more problematic since the letters don't quite match up, and same is true of Persian, but both of those were at various times transliterated into Hebrew. And Yiddish is a German dialect which uses Hebrew characters. Ladino is a Spanish dialect which does the same thing. So all of those 8 different languages can be written in Hebrew. And just by picking up a piece of parchment written in Hebrew, it's not always clear exactly which language you're looking at. Now, in addition to that, the papers in the Geniza include probably a dozen other languages as well that are in their native alphabets. Okay. Any questions on anything so far? Okay.
I've got Richard. Can you explain the business about the name of God? If the name of God could not be written by Orthodox Jews, and they'd use like a Y W without the vowels. How could the document have the name of God in it if they never wrote the name of God?
Well, the YHWH is the name of God. That is considered a holy symbol, and in fact, when scribes, Jewish scribes, were copying, and of course the scrolls had to be copied a number of times. They had to stop before they wrote those four letters, and go through a ritual purification, and then they could proceed with that, the drawing of those characters. So initially, it is only those four characters that are considered the name of God, but later it gets extended. So Adonai, which is a nickname for God, if you will, is also extended, is considered a name of God. And so it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's usually the word that's translated as the Lord in our English translations. So there's literally hundreds of places in the Torah, in the books of the various books of the Torah, where the name of God is there. And again, it would be in prayer books and in printed prayers and so forth. But there was a tremendous amount. You didn't just go out and write the name of God on a whitewash on a wall. That was not permitted. There was a very elaborate ritual involved in writing the name of God.
Thank you.
Okay, let's move on to something different. I want to talk about the political and the religious situation in Egypt at this time. I'm going to start with the political situation. And this is not a comprehensive view. I'm just doing a very quick overview. But the Islamic rule in Egypt lasted from 640 CE to 1952, when officially Egypt became a secular state. Though obviously there's a tremendous amount of Islamic control even in Egypt today. The power passed through 9 major dynasties before annexation by the Ottoman Empire in 1517. So you have 9 different groups of rulers, belonging in many cases to different families. During this time of the 9 major dynasties, there were 191 separate rulers. That's a lot of rulers. The bulk of the Cairo Geniza documents are from the periods of 3 dynasties: the Fatimid, which is from 969 to 1071, the Ayyubid from 1171 to 1260, and the Mamluk from 1250 to 1517, and the collapse to the Ottomans. That looks like a misprint, but actually the Ayyubid and the Mamluk rulers kind of overlapped a little bit. They were fighting for control of the country. And some of the later documents that I'll be talking about more next week are from the Ottoman period. Now, with some short exceptions, Islamic rulers promoted tolerance and freedom of religion to all faiths. The basic priorities of most Islamic rulers were the maintenance of order, number 1, and the promotion of trade and commerce and money, number 2. Most of the governors, who were called emirs, if the caliph was not in Egypt, and the caliph, I should say, most of the governors and the caliphs were not historically significant. There are two exceptions, Al-Hakim and Saladin. And I won't talk much about Saladin because he is, I think, pretty well known, a major figure in historical literature and also in plays and operas and movies and whatever else. But the next slide, I want to talk about Al-Hakim. He was caliph from 996 to 1021. He's remembered primarily for three things. First of all, he persecuted the Christians and the Jews, and he ordered the destruction of all the churches and synagogues in his realm, which is estimated somewhere around 20,000 altogether. Churches and synagogues were destroyed during his reign. That included the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem and also the synagogue we're talking about here in Old Cairo. The other thing he's remembered for is support of the Druze movement within the Shia Islamic division. I'll talk a little bit more about the Druze in a moment. Perhaps one of the most outstanding things about Al-Hakim is that on February 13th, 1021, 1,000 years ago, he went for a walk in the evening and was never seen again. Historians assume he was probably murdered. However, some of his followers maintain that he was taken directly into heaven and will return at some point. And so both within the Druze movement and also some within the Shia movement, there are some who still believe that Al-Hakim will return. Okay, next slide. Now, I want to talk about the religious situation. Any questions about the political situation before we move on?
You mentioned that there were three main periods in which the documents were stored. There seems to have been a 100-year period in which there was kind of a lack of documents. The first period ended at 1071. The second one started at 1171. Was that a mistake?
Yeah, there were documents stored during that period, but it was not any of the ruling dynasties at that point that were in control. But yeah, the documents, and I'll talk a little bit more about the dating of the documents, but they were collected pretty much continuously on through the 11th, 12th, and into the 13th century. That slide was misleading because it does omit one of the dynasties that is not a particularly significant one. Okay, anything else on the political situation? Then I want to talk about the religious situation. And the religions of the people of Egypt at this point basically fall into different categories: Christians, Muslims, Jews, and none of the above. And by none of the above, I included the Zoroastrians because I think those are the more likely that Egyptians would have come into contact with and may have actually had some Zoroastrians living in Cairo at this time. As far as contact with Hindus and Buddhists, I think very, very, very unlikely. So we have Christians, Muslims, and Jews primarily, and maybe a few people from other groups. So let's look at the groups individually. The Christians were divided into two major groups, the Greek Orthodox and the Coptic. Now, these two groups were not really on speaking terms with each other, had not been for several hundred years, but they were both contending for members. The Nestorian and Armenian groups were a minority, though they were present in Egypt at this time. And again, all of these divisions, the Greek Orthodox, Coptic, Nestorian, Armenian, come out of the split over the Chalcedonian formulation. So this is a split that goes all the way back to the 5th and 6th century. After the split between Eastern and Western Christianity, you start to have a few Roman Catholics in Egypt at this time, but they're a pretty small group. I included Gnostics because there are some historians who maintain that Gnosticism remained alive during the Middle Ages. I rather doubt that. From what I'm reading, Gnosticism pretty well died out in the 6th century, so there wouldn't have been anybody around from that group. So that's the Christians. Now let's take a look at the Muslims. The Muslims are also deeply divided. The Sunni are the majority group. The Shia are the minority group, but during the Fatimid period, they are the rulers, which creates a kind of an interesting situation. Within the Shia, there is a group called the Ismailis, and that group is actually part of among the rulers of Egypt. The term Ismaili may look familiar because there's a fairly substantial congregation of Ismaili Muslims in our neighborhood, just south of Devon. The Sufis are a kind of a subgroup that's very difficult to number and to identify. They're mostly within the Sunni tradition, but some of them kind of even drift out of that. And then finally we have the Druze. And the Druze are a kind of a mysterious religion. In fact, at one point, for a member of the Druze faith to tell anything about the beliefs and the activities of the Druze meant a death penalty. The Druze are a kind of a curious mixture of Islam with some little pieces of Christianity and some pieces of Judaism mixed in. And they were fairly strong in Egypt at this time. And like I say, one of the sultans, Al-Hakeem, was very sympathetic toward them. Today, the Druze are found almost entirely in 3 countries, Syria, Lebanon, and northern part of Israel. Okay, let's move on to the Jewish community. And here we have a situation in which the Cairo Geniza and other documents that have been uncovered have kind of rewritten the history of medieval Judaism. Because it was always assumed that after the collapse of the second Jewish rebellion, that all of the different sects and groups within Judaism died out, except for 2, the Rabbinic Jews and the Christians. At one point, it's speculated there may have been as many as 40 different sects and brands of Judaism, but that all dies with the collapse, with the destruction of the temple, and then 100 years later with the second rebellion. Now we've learned that there were significant minority movements within Judaism in the Middle Ages, and the main one was what is called the Karaite Judaism, which were a minority, though at some points in some locations they seem to have been a challenge to the Rabbinic Judaism. Now, I should point out that in the Middle Ages, in Cairo, in Old Cairo, there were 3 synagogues. There was a Karaite synagogue, but there were 2 rabbinic synagogues. There was a Palestinian and a Babylonian. Now, this doesn't talk about the nationality of the people that joined them, but it has to do with where they saw their authority. So if somebody in a Palestinian congregation had a question about doctrine or practice, they would write to the learned teachers in Palestine. Similarly with the Babylonians, they would write to the people in Babylon or Baghdad or wherever. And they had different Talmuds. And to this day, there's two different Talmuds, a Palestinian and a Babylonian. So, and there's a fairly big split here. The Karaites considered themselves the true Jews, whereas the others were apostates, and the rabbinic Jews considered the Karaites to be heretics. So it was not a lot of space for discussion there. In addition to that, you had various forms of Judaism that had more kind of a regional aspect to it. You have Yemeni Jews, Sephardic Jews, primarily from Europe, and then Ashkenazic Jews in the later period, and that is primarily from Eastern Europe. Now, we have a curious phenomenon of which we don't know very much, but that is that there was an attempt kind of to merge Islam and Judaism in a Sufi movement, a mystical, contemplative type of religion. And again, like I say, we don't know much about it except we know that it existed. Okay, let's move on. Religious conflict in medieval Europe. On the whole, conflict between Jews, Christians, and Muslims seems to have been minimal and was probably related to local grievances. There does not seem to have been any period of persecution other than Al-Hakeem and one other time that you actually had active persecution of non-Muslims. Actually, there was persecution of Muslims at certain times too, if they happened to be on the wrong side of the fence. There were no ghettos in Egypt, and I have to emphasize that. Members of all three faiths shared neighborhoods and often buildings. So you may have like an apartment building that had two Muslim families, one Christian and one Jewish. This was not unusual at that time. Business partnerships among members of the three faiths were common. I might mention in this regard, medical practices also included people of the three faiths, and often Muslim and Christian medical students studied under Jewish doctors. And while the government was controlled by Muslims, Jews and Christians often held prominent positions in the bureaucracy. And this was not always appreciated by some of the more radical Muslims. Let me get a drink of tea here and I'll proceed. There's a wonderful story that one of the sultans, and I have no idea what year this was, one of the sultans was approached by Muslim leadership, religious leadership, who were very unhappy over the fact that one of his primary advisors was Christian and another one was Jewish. Said they've got to go. We don't like this. And so the Sultan caved in and not only had his two chief advisors fired, but also jailed. And a few days later, the Muslim leaders came back and said, you got to let them out. This country is falling apart. And so it became fairly customary, maybe not that high in the bureaucracy, but various levels of bureaucracy were manned by Jews and Christians during this period. The real religious conflict occurred not between Muslims, Jews, and Christians, but within each faith group. So Jew versus Jew, Muslim versus Muslim, and Christian versus Christian. Okay, next slide. So let's go back to the Geniza and talk a little bit more about it. Any questions on the religious situation or anything else I've covered up to this point? Okay. I want to welcome, I see Greg Chrome has joined us and Ray Lipscomb, and welcome to both of you. There may be other people that I'm not seeing on the screen here. So anyway, let's go back to the Cairo Geniza. What was in it, and why is it important? Well, it was much bigger than a broom closet, which is what it was in some synagogues. No pictures of the actual room appear to have survived. I've searched a number of places and nothing. But it was a two-story room, accessible only through an opening on the second floor of the synagogue off the women's gallery. Now, you must remember, this is an Orthodox synagogue, and so women were not allowed on the main floor of the synagogue. They could only take part in the service liturgy from the women's gallery, which was on the second floor. So a little corner of that gallery, there was an opening, and that's where you could dump things into the Geniza. Now, the stack of paper and books, when Solomon Shakhtar found it, was approximately 14 feet high. Just picture that, a 14-foot stack paper. Some of it hundreds of years old, much of it in pretty bad condition. Okay, the exact number of documents that was in the Geniza is uncertain because parts of the collection have been scattered. Cambridge University, which has the largest collection, Oxford University, the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, there is a collection in St. Petersburg, also in Paris at the Louvre, and a number of institutes in Jerusalem. And there are also some smaller collections in places like Vienna and Budapest and Geneva. The second problem is that the provenance of some of the pieces is obscure. We don't really know if they're from the Ben Ezra Geniza, or from some other Geniza, or if they were part of the boxes that were unearthed from the graveyard. And so whether to count them as Geniza documents is kind of uncertain. But a conservative estimate of the Geniza documents puts the number of documents and pages of bound volumes at well over 400,000. And considering everything, a figure approaching 500,000 is probably not unreasonable. Okay, next slide. A little bit more about the Geniza. The Shakhtar Taylor Geniza collection at Cambridge University, which is named after Solomon Shakhtar and Charles Taylor, who was a major benefactor of the collection. It includes over 200,000 documents, most of which have been cataloged and filmed, and some of which are available online, for that matter. Now, the next statement is probably not true. The oldest document from the Geniza is probably from the late 6th or early 7th century. There is some debate about this, that it may be even 100 years earlier than that, from the late 5th and early 6th century. These are documents, obviously, that were thrown into the Geniza, many, many years later. And the bulk of the documents fall into two date ranges, from 1100 to 1275, and from 1500 to 1675. That 1675 figure is a little loose. Maybe you want to push it up a little bit to 1700. There are a few later pieces from the 18th century as well. Now, what's in the Geniza? Well, it's a rather mind-bending collection. Included are Torah scrolls, Torah commentaries, midrashes, etc., prayer books, liturgical materials, including some musical notation, questions that have been placed before learned rabbis and their responses, personal diaries of members of the congregation, records of court proceedings, lawsuits, etc., papers for marriage and divorce, business correspondence, shipping and transportation schedules, private prayers and meditations, minutes of community meetings, and governmental mandates. That's a starting list. I mean, there's probably another couple dozen types of documents. Now, also found in the Geniza were a small number of heretical writings. This is another reason why you can put something in the Geniza, not because it is sacred and needs to be buried at some point, but because it's heretical and it's dangerous for people to have access to it. And so these writings, there's a couple of them, were probably deemed too dangerous for public viewing, and they were therefore imprisoned in the Geniza. One of these, incidentally, is a document that was also found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, next slide. Okay, I just want to wind up here with a kind of another aside. Some of the most interesting and intriguing and interesting documents of the Cairo Geniza are palimpsests. This is a word I hate because I never seem to be able to spell it correctly or to pronounce it correctly. But anyway, that's the word. And it's a manuscript or a piece of writing material on which the original writing has been effaced to make room for later writing, but of which traces remain. The term has also been extended a little bit to include documents that are written at one time on one side and then at a later time with something else on another side. This, however, is the strict definition. Okay, next slide. This is an actual picture of one of the palimpsests from the Cairo Geniza. A very, very interesting document. The part you see at the top, this is in Greek, is from Achaia, generation after the creation of the Gospels. So this is like from 120 to 140 CE. However, this copy was probably made, according to this slide, was made about 500 CE, maybe a little bit later. And this is actually, the text is from the book of Kings, 2 Kings. Achaia was one of the scholars who at this time gathered together different translations or versions of the Bible and tried to unify them. And he created a book called the Hexapla. So this is probably a copy of a page of the Hexapla. What is fascinating about this is that somebody about maybe 500 or 600 years later decided to use this scrap of paper to write a liturgical poem or part of a worship service on it. Now, when you think about if you are in the Middle Ages and you want to write something down, say for instance you want to write a speech or something like that, you have your pen in hand, but you need a piece of paper. So there are no stationery stores. You can't run out and get some paper or parchment. And even if you could find one, it's very expensive. So instead what you do is you look for a piece of paper that's already been used. And if you're lucky, it's only been written on one side. And you can use the other side for your notes. If you're unlucky, it's already been written on both sides. And so what you have to do is use a brush or a rag and some solvent or something and try and get rid of the original writing so you can use it as your document. And that's apparently what happened here. Though, again, as you know, whenever you try to erase something, it never quite works out the way you expected. And so in this case, the original writing from the 6th century remained readable. And the the liturgical text in Hebrew, which is upside down, is now also readable. And it turns out that this is from a poem, a liturgical poem, a liturgical song that had been lost for hundreds and hundreds of years by a man by the name of Yanai. And I'll talk more about him in the next lecture. Okay, one more slide. And I include this not because it's part of the Cairo Geniza, it's not. And it's not a true palimpsest, but it's an example of kind of the weirdness you find when you're looking through ancient documents. These were probably both written in the 11th century, maybe about 50 years apart or so. And it starts out, one side was used for a papyrus scroll of the Exodus, and then the back side was used for the beginning of the book of Revelation. No connection between the two at all. Whether it was just a copyist who was doing experimenting or what, we don't know. But they're on two sides of the same piece of parchment. And what it was also interesting is the dating of this is probably from around the year 250, a long, long time ago. It's in Greek, and so the likelihood is that this was not a Jewish writing. This was a Christian writing. Okay. Pastor Monty, are you still there?
I am still here, yes.
Okay, could we have the next slide? Okay, that kind of concludes where I'm going today. Next week, I want to talk about, as I said, the recovery of some lost liturgical poetry and even recovery of some poets that had been forgotten. A look at the Maimonides family, which I really didn't talk about today, but they're an important part of Egyptian society during this period. The community of geniuses, which I prefer to call them, who actually unlocked the secret of the Genitals. There's about a dozen people that were involved in this process, and of course hundreds more that contributed, but like a dozen or so major figures. And then finally, try to recapture from what they have discovered is what the culture of this Mediterranean society during the Middle Ages, particularly the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries looked like. So that's sort of where we are. We want to go to the last slide, Pastor? Okay. Now, are there any questions on anything that, if you think of something during the week and you can join us next Sunday, I'm happy to answer them, or you can just email me if you have any questions. But like I say, this has been an overview. This is, there have been thousands of scholars working on this Geniza, and only about 3 major books on the subject, but a lot of scholarly articles. So there's just a tremendous amount of literature involved with it.
Richard, I'm interested in the documents that are recovered from the graveyard, and whether there's been any controversy at unearthing those, if they continue to have the same piety to bury documents that have the Word of God written in them.
Well, I mean, certainly grave robbing is a serious offense in Judaism, as in any religion. It appears that some of the opening of these Geniza graves, if you will, was actually done by members of the congregation. This is a good way to get income as you sell these documents to various antiquities dealers. So there does not seem to have been any great problem in terms of the impiety of digging up these documents. But like I say, the records were not very well kept of where things came from. And so we don't know. We're pretty certain that the Cambridge collection are from the Genitals itself. They're not the grave or the buried documents. But some of the collections in other places may very well be.
Richard, I'm kind of curious as to why the synagogue authorities coughed up all those documents to Cambridge. Why did they do it?
Well, apparently Shakhtar was the kind of man who could sell refrigerators to Eskimos. I mean, he was a very persuasive, a very affable person, and apparently he got the confidence of the leaders of the synagogue that all these documents would be much better taken care of in an English university setting than they were in the Geniza. And he also, and there was probably some bribes involved in terms of getting the Egyptian officials to let these documents leave. But again, like I say, Shakhtar was an extremely persuasive man, and he did such a good job that if you want to study the Cairo Geniza, and like I say, there are still hundreds of people doing it, you don't go to Egypt. There's nothing left there. You go to Cambridge, or you go to Oxford, or you go to St. Petersburg, or you go to New York City. And that's where you can do the study on the documents. Or increasingly, you can simply go online. And there are pictures of a lot of these documents.
Thank you.
But it does seem, now again, we have to remember this was in 1896, and if it happened today, I don't think the Egyptian authorities would be that happy to see all these documents removed. But at that time, there was a feeling that maybe the Europeans had a better way of handling antiquities, and Cambridge, Oxford, the British Museum, and the Louvre are filled with things that were raided out of Egypt.
Richard, I'm sorry to pester you with questions, but as I recall, the Leningrad Codex of the Masoretic translation or copy of the Bible was written in Cairo early in the 11th century. Could that have been copied in this synagogue or in another synagogue? You mentioned there were three.
I don't know the provenance of that. I don't think that the Leningrad Codex has anything to do with the Cairo Geniza. I think that was found in a. Well, I don't know. I was going to say it was found in a monastery, but that doesn't seem to make sense. So I'm not sure. I'll have to look that up.
The title page of the Codex says it was. That names the author and says it was copied in 1008 in Cairo.
Yeah, well, that if that had worn out, that would have certainly been a good candidate for the Geniza. But again, as I say, that was discovered somewhere else. But I'd have to look that up.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Have I mystified or confused everybody?
You did a great job, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you,
Well,
Richard.
thank you all. It's great to
Richard.
have you
Thank you, Richard.
here. And again, if you can join us, I know Brad wants to join us next week. He had a rehearsal this afternoon. So I'm hoping that all of you will join us again next Sunday.
Have a blessed week.
You too.
Okay.
Advent blessings.
All right. Bye.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.